It is 8 o'clock on a cold, damp spring morning in April 1945, where a dense Bavarian fog clings to the pine tops and wraps around a gravel crossroads in rural Germany. The idling diesel engines of a Third Army Command convoy vibrate through the wet soil, sending thick gray clouds of exhaust mixing into the freezing mist. Maps distributed at dawn by division movement officers dictate that the entire column must turn left onto a wide, paved primary highway leading straight toward the advancing front. Near the head of the line sits 23-year-old Corporal Joe Miller in the driver's seat of an open reconnaissance jeep, his right hand resting on the polished casing of a brass pocket compass given to him by his grandfather before shipping overseas. Instead of turning left, Miller grips the steering wheel hard, swerves his vehicle to the right, and bounces onto an unpaved, deeply rutted dirt farm track. He turns around in his bucket seat and shouts back to the passenger in the trailing olive-drab sedan, "Sir, that left road culvert collapsed 3 years ago during the spring floods. The stone bed washed out beneath the tarmac and a 6x6 will break straight through. The entire line of staff vehicles grinds to an immediate, terrifying halt. Officers inside the sedans freeze in place. Captains and majors stare straight ahead in stunned disbelief, calculating the immediate professional ruin of a low-ranking driver overriding written movement orders. In the back seat of the main command car sits General George S. Patton, Jr., his leather-gloved hands rested flat against his knees, his pale eyes locked onto the back of the young corporal's helmet without uttering a sound. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether an entire armored advance reached its objective on time or sank into a devastating traffic bottleneck. And the answer was not what anyone in that fog-choked valley was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications for every deep dive into hidden history. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it cost Corporal Joe Miller to swerve his jeep onto that dirt track, you need to understand what a Third Army Command column actually was in the final weeks of the European War. It was not a casual convoy or a leisurely road trip. It was the nerve center of a 3-star army moving across enemy territory at 30 miles a day. Inside those sedans, trucks, and armored command cars were the staff officers, radio teams, mapping sections, and tactical commanders responsible for coordinating tens of thousands of advancing troops. In the spring fog of Bavaria, a movement order was not considered a suggestion or a rough outline. It was a binding contract drawn up by division quartermasters, checked by staff colonels, approved by Army intelligence, and stamped with official authority. A driver in a lead jeep had one single job: hold the steering wheel, maintain 20 miles per hour, follow the drawn red line on the acetate map, and keep his mouth shut. He was not paid to evaluate civil infrastructure. He was not asked to judge the structural load of German masonry. To countermand a written staff order in front of 20 senior officers was an unpardonable breach of military discipline. In any army, in any conflict, a low-ranking soldier who takes it upon himself to change a column's route invites chaos, delays, and immediate disciplinary action. Every staff major in those trailing vehicles saw the fog and saw the dirt track, but not one of them dared to speak up, because obeying the paper was safe, while trusting one's own eyes meant stepping onto thin ice, and the operational arithmetic of armored movement allowed zero margin for error. A fully loaded 6x6 cargo truck weighs over 12 tons, packed to the wooden bow frames with high-explosive artillery shells, gasoline drums, and infantry rations. If the lead transport vehicle breaks through a decayed wooden culvert or collapses a hollow tarmac roadbed, it does not simply slow down. It shears its front axle, drops 6 feet into a mud-filled trench, and locks a 4-mile-long column of heavy armor onto a single-lane road in dense fog. Trapped between steep rock embankments and thick forest lines, hundreds of idling vehicles become immobile, sitting targets for enemy artillery spotters or lingering anti-tank teams hiding in the ridges. The cost of that single structural failure is not paid in administrative delays. It is calculated in burned supply trucks, lost hours of tactical momentum, and frontline infantrymen waiting for ammunition that never arrives on time. That was the cold math running through the fog when Joe Miller swerved his wheel. Picture the scene inside that valley. 22 military vehicles sit nose to tail along the narrow gravel track, their exhaust pipes sputtering in the cold morning air. Heavy condensation drips off the canvas roofs of the troop transports, hitting the muddy ground with a quiet, Steady thud. Inside the lead jeep, Corporal Joe Miller stands frozen, his knuckles white around the wheel, his thumb pressing hard against his grandfather's brass compass. Beside him, a young navigation lieutenant sits rigid, his grease pencil suspended 2 inches above a clear map overlay, unable to process what has just occurred. In the front seat of the general's car, Captain Douglas Hall watches the rearview mirror with a dry throat, waiting for the blast of 3-star fury that typically follows any disruption of command protocol. Every officer present is calculating the same terrifying dilemma: follow written authority into a hidden trap, or trust the unsanctioned judgment of an enlisted driver. Stay with me, because what happened next in that fog-choked crossroads is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts preserved from that morning in rural Bavaria are remarkably consistent. General Patton did not lean out the window to shout. He did not reach for his ivory-handled revolvers, nor did he demand to see the driver's service record. Instead, he sat back in the deep leather cushions of the sedan, looking at Corporal Joe Miller, the exact way a master structural engineer examines a plumb line that has revealed a flaw in a building's foundation. Patton extended his left arm through the open window, raised 2 gloved fingers into the mist, and made a slow, deliberate sweeping gesture to the right, ordering the entire staff column to follow the corporal's jeep down the dirt farm track. He did not ask for a staff explanation. He did not demand a revised map overlay. He simply let the young corporal lead the way through the fog. For 6 miles, the heavy column snaked along the rutted dirt path, bypassing the collapsed masonry culvert on the main road and rejoining the primary advance highway 3 miles beyond the danger zone without losing a single vehicle or a single minute of operational time. Captain Douglas Hall, who observed the entire incident from the front seat of the command car, later wrote in his personal journal that Patton's reaction was defined by a single word: reality. See what many military historians fail to grasp about George S. Patton Jr. is that beneath his flamboyant public persona lay a ruthless, cold-blooded tactical pragmatist. Patton understood that paper maps drawn in heated headquarters tents 40 miles behind the front lines were based on static, outdated intelligence. He knew that a gold leaf on an officer's collar could not reinforce a decayed timber bridge or support 12 tons of rolling steel. Personal pride and rigid chain of command vanity do not push an army forward when the ground beneath the tires gives way. By accepting the driver's unsanctioned reroute, Patton was not undermining authority or being lenient. He was prioritizing physical ground truth over staff paperwork, because on an advancing front line, bad data is far more dangerous than an enemy counterattack. A commander who ignores a physical fact because it was presented by a lower-ranking man is a commander who invites needless disaster. To understand why Corporal Joe Miller was so certain about the collapsed culvert, you have to look at his civilian life in Terre Haute, Indiana. Before the war, Miller spent 3 years as a junior road inspector for the Wabash County Highway Department, working under senior civil engineers who taught him to evaluate structural timber, concrete piers, and drainage runoff along rural county roads. His grandfather, a combat engineer veteran of the Spanish-American War, had handed him the brass pocket compass on the morning he boarded the troop train, advising him never to trust a paper drawing over the physical evidence of his own eyes. When Miller swerved his jeep onto the dirt track, he was not guessing. He was relying on years of practical experience evaluating heavy load tolerances under wet soil conditions. After returning home from Europe, Miller resumed his career with the County Highway Department, eventually serving 30 years as Chief Bridge Inspector for Western Indiana. Until his death in 1992, he kept his grandfather's brass compass mounted on his drafting desk, reminding junior inspectors that real leadership and safety depend on honoring physical ground truth over official paperwork. Every officer who served under General George S. Patton Jr. during the European campaign understood that the Third Army operated at a tempo unmatched by any other command. Decisions that would take days in rear echelon headquarters were executed in minutes along the forward line, driven by Patton's belief that speed, audacity, and relentless pressure were the ultimate life-saving tools on a battlefield. Yet this relentless drive was balanced by an unyielding respect for practical competence on the ground, proving time and again that a commander who listens to physical ground truth is a commander who achieves decisive victory. The historical records preserved from the Third Army's advance across Europe demonstrate a consistent pattern. Tactical momentum relied not merely on grand strategic maps, but on the quiet, unheralded competence of ordinary soldiers doing their duty under extreme pressure, whether in the freezing mud of the Ardennes or the dust of western France. Moments of unexpected courage and technical precision defined the true character of the Allied war effort. Military historians who study the European theater often note that leadership in combat requires a rare combination of absolute authority and quiet humility. To command hundreds of thousands of men across enemy territory demands unwavering resolve, but to recognize the truth when presented by a lower-ranking subordinate requires genuine greatness of character. The physical realities of driving heavy supply vehicles across post-winter European soil required continuous tactical adjustment. In April 1945, as the Third Army expanded its advance deep into central Germany, road reconnaissance was plagued by unmapped flood damage, destroyed stone culverts, and hasty enemy demolitions. Driver Corporal Joe Miller had spent months navigating secondary roads, developing a sharp eye for subtle signs of ground instability, such as water pooling over tarmac edges, cracked drainage shoulders, and sagging road crowns. When he halted his jeep at the Bavarian crossroads, he knew that a 12-ton 6x6 carrying high-explosive ordnance would instantly crush a compromised culvert, creating a bottleneck that could trap miles of trailing armor. By placing his vehicle on the unpaved farm track and guiding the command column safely around the hazard, Miller demonstrated the crucial value of practical battlefield observation over static staff paperwork. The operational speed of Patton's Third Army was built upon the relentless initiative of frontline NCOs and drivers who understood local terrain. When an advancing column of 12-ton supply trucks and armored personnel carriers encounters a compromised bridge or culvert, the immediate duty of a lead driver is to safeguard the momentum of the entire unit. By recognizing that paper staff maps prepared weeks in advance could not account for localized stream erosion, Corporal Joe Miller acted with the exact kind of practical battlefield intelligence that Patton valued above staff dogma. The successful reroute through the Bavarian farm track preserved vital supplies and reinforced the core principle of Third Army operations. Physical ground reality always takes precedence over administrative paperwork. Corporal Joe Miller was 23 years old, born and raised in Terre Haute, Indiana. Before the draft brought him into the Third Army Motor Pool, he spent 3 years working as a junior surveyor for the Wabash County Highway Department, spending his summers inspecting wooden timber bridges, concrete culverts, and rural drainage ditches across western Indiana. His grandfather, a veteran combat engineer from the Spanish-American War, had handed him the brass pocket compass on the morning he boarded the troop train, telling him never to trust a paper drawing over the evidence of his own eyes. When Miller returned home to Indiana after the war, he went right back to work for the County Highway Department, eventually serving 30 years as chief bridge inspector for the region. Until his death in 1992, he kept that grandfather's brass compass resting on his drafting desk, telling his junior inspectors that the most important lesson he ever learned about structural engineering was delivered on a fog-choked dirt road in Bavaria, when a 3-star general proved that a real leader always values physical truth over official paperwork. Was General Patton right to accept an unsanctioned reroute on the word of an enlisted driver? Some would say that permitting a lower-ranking soldier to override written movement orders degrades the absolute authority required to command an army in combat, opening the door for chaos across the entire front line. Others would say exactly the opposite, arguing that true operational brilliance lies in trusting the practical intelligence of the man on the ground when rigid paperwork threatens to destroy the mission. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.